Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, coaching, and 360-degree feedback in particular. Dr. Rose personally coaches over 150 leaders per year, including focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals, and his book, Hire Better Teachers Now, was recently released by Harvard Education Press. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rose.
Thanks, Jesse, and thank you all for joining me today. I'm happy to be here talking about one of my favorite topics, 360-degree feedback, and in particular addressing the question that's become kind of more and more popular around how 360s might fit in with performance management. And in fact, we've got kind of an interesting intersection we'll be talking about where 360 is more and more popular and performance management may be a little bit less popular. And so how do these two go together? And I'm going to talk a little bit about how 360s might be able to help augment and address some of the issues that performance management is facing today. So let me first start by just telling you a little bit about us, a little bit about the firm and our organization, what we do. The D's in our 3D group stand for data-driven decisions, and I think it's important. It was kind of an important conceptual element for us when we started our firm almost a little over 20 years ago, to be thinking about the premise that data ought to drive our decisions, whether they're decisions about development, decisions around talent, decisions around programs. These should be decisions that are made with some concrete data rather than just sort of that water cooler opinion that everyone's got one way or another. So all of what we do has some sort of a metrics grounding in it in terms of how can we use these data to really systematically approach decision making. We also, as a consequence, and you'll see that in our presentation today, really tend to focus on a research base. So there's a huge research base, scientific research base in industrial organizational psychology that supports all the recommendations that we make, and I'm going to be referencing some of those today. I think it's important that you've got that kind of peer-reviewed research behind what you're doing. You don't want to get lost in the academics too much. You want to be applying them to the workplace, which is critical, of course. But if you don't have some kind of research founding, then it ends up being just opinions, and those opinions don't always match with the facts. So it's good to have some data behind what you're talking about. And also just to point out, we do work with a wide range of organizations. One of the disciplines we've always had is not to sort of specialize in a particular industry, a particular track of type of organization. We tend to work with, you know, everything from we've got a company we work with that's a circus. We've got companies that we work with that are technology, retail, every kind of company you can imagine. And we tend to focus on kind of three core areas. 360 feedback is one of our primary focal areas. Employee surveys, also broad engagement surveys, things like this. But then both of those feed into the work we do around leadership development. So again, what do you do with those data that you've collected and guide decisions, et cetera? Okay, so enough about us. Let's take a look at our topic today. So I thought we'd start with a perspective on what is it like when you're getting a performance review. So what's going on with performance review today? So one perspective, many of us have had a performance review, and often we walk into the performance review with some expectations and we walk out with an entirely different experience. Our friend Pam here is no different. One of the things I think is really funny about this particular comment, and of course popular culture comes up with some great elements like this, is that the upside, if you will, the positive that Pam is looking for in itself is somewhat inaccurate. So what's really funny is that it really shouldn't be, a performance review really shouldn't be about hopes and dreams either. Perhaps there's a component of that in terms of what Pam might be doing in the future and her aspirations, but there really ought to be something around how she's doing and she's doing to get there, and really looking at her performance from a somewhat objective perspective. So I think the basic message, though, is that one way or another, the expectations on both sides of the formula in terms of performance management are a little bit broken. Well, this year also wasn't the best of years for performance review in the news. So if we look at performance reviews and what their how they looked in the news. It was a bit of a feeding frenzy around the performance reviews. We started at the beginning of the year with the New York Times saying that performance don't work, and we ended at the end of the year, near the end of the year, with SHRM asking the question, are performance reviews dead? So very popular, a lot of press around this. We probably could have put twice as many up there, but a lot of press around performance reviews sort of being broken, not working. Maybe we should get rid of them. Indeed, you would get the sense from reading the press that organizations are, in a sense, no longer doing this. Now, again, there are organizations, reputable organizations, GE, Netflix, Accenture, others, that have indeed stopped using their performance reviews. But it turns out it's maybe not quite as bad as it would seem. So when you look at the actual study and the actual research, there was a study by the Corporate Research Board that found 94% of companies are still doing performance reviews. So yes, indeed, 6% may have eliminated or significantly modified to the point where they're not recognizable from their previous form, but a pretty significant number of firms continue to do performance reviews. And so, but the question remains, maybe we're still doing them, but are they broken? How might we fix them? So one of the things I want to do is to take a look at and think about, well, why do we do performance reviews? What are we really trying to get? What's the value of performance reviews? Why are these 94% not following the lead of these other organizations and getting rid of their performance review? If you look at performance reviews and what they do, they provide sort of three fundamental components for an organization, a manager, an employee. The first is they can provide improvement feedback. So what did you do well and what didn't you do well? And let's, in talking to your manager, what can you learn from that around how to do better in the future? So that improvement feedback is certainly one component of most performance reviews, or should be. And most performance reviews are going to include sort of goals for the future that are developmental. What can you do to grow and develop in the next year based on what you've done this last year? That's one element. Another piece is allocating rewards, the simple notion of who's going to get a higher raise, who's going to get a lower raise. Could also be who's going to get this position or that position, sort of identifying where talent might move and knowing kind of how they've done. If you've got an employee that has struggled again and again and again in a position, then giving more responsibility might not be the best choice. And so one way to look at that is to consider it is to look at the performance review. And then last but not least, certainly the ability to document for legal protection for the organization how performance has been. So if you've got an employee who continues to underperform and underperform and underperform, you've got a nice track record there to be able to reference as you may get them moving out of the organization. So all three of these things are really critical values that are very important for organizations for various different reasons. A reason I would suspect that performance reviews will not disappear anytime soon, at least not for a large number of the organizations. And fundamentally, frankly, even the 6% are still going to need to find different ways of doing this. So even if an organization's gotten rid of their performance review because it certainly sounds good on the front page or business page, they're still going to need to find ways to do these three different elements. So let's take a look at what performance review does and how it looks in terms of when it's at its best. So this is a graphic and a tool we use when we do our performance management workshop we do with organizations to help managers learn to think about how to evaluate their employees better. One of the things we talk about is how performance is skewed a little bit toward the positive, right? People that are on the left side of this curve tend to exit the organization one way or another because they're just struggling. So you tend to have a slightly positive curve in terms of what performance looks like. And of course, numbers are not exact in terms of the percentages here or there, but the point being that you've got some small number of underperformers, you've got a very large number of people who are basically doing their job, and then you've got a small number of people that are doing their job and almost bored in it because it's so easy, and they're just your superstars that are delivering at a very high level. So if you think about this as the profile of the workforce, you've got to look at performance management as a process fundamentally of moving people along this curve. So one of the things we do is we look at the underperformers. So underperformers, kind of a subtlety here, but there's this line of that managers need to draw of, okay, on the left side of it, we're going to actually exit these people. They're underperforming, they're consistently underperforming, and they're underperforming at a very extreme degree. So these folks need to leave the organization. But then there are these underperformers that you want to move up the line and try to move them into proficient. And so that's one of the fundamental elements of what managers need to be able to do, is to make a decision. Are they moving this way? Are they moving that way? And then what can I do to help them move this way or that way? And performance reviews can be very helpful for both of these, frankly, if for no other reason, to let people know where they're at on that line. And then, as I mentioned, the documentation or the tool for helping them to improve. Now, when you look at the middle part of this curve, you've got this huge group of folks that are kind of, doing the job. Some of them are doing it a little better, and some are doing a little worse. And what managers ought to be doing from a performance management standpoint and improvement standpoint, again, this is that improvement component, is helping move these folks from left to right. So each one of those individuals, you should be having a conversation not about you're not doing your job or you are doing your job, but how can you do it better? And good managers can help move people up the curve. And then, of course, the last group are these superstars. And the superstars, what you're trying to do with superstars, and this is one of the hardest things to teach managers and to sort of buy into, if you will, is you're actually trying to move them out of your organization and not out of the company per se, but if you don't have a place for them to move up, you need to, as a manager, move them into a different place and get them functional. And so in all of these four phases of managing someone's performance, having a very clear, systematic conversation about how an employee is doing managing their performance can be useful in getting them to move up the curve again or move out one way or the other. So this is really how performance management ought to work. I guess the question is it performing that well? The news, if you read the front page, may suggest that it's not. We've got some data also to look at there. So one of the things we did is we took a look at our own data. So we do employee engagement surveys, as I mentioned. So when we look into our database of thousands and thousands of employees, and we look at one of the questions there around, is your my last performance evaluation helped me to improve, right? The core element of what performance evaluation should do, or at least one of the three. We find only 52% of people, of employees, agree with that statement. So only 52% of employees actually feel that the performance evaluation is achieving one of the top three goals for the tool. Now, ironically, 47% feel they're paid well, that they're satisfied with their pay. So performance evaluation is only slightly better than pay. I mean, people are pretty willing to say that they think they ought to be paid more. So clearly there's room to improve from the data that we see across a wide number of organizations in terms of employees' perceptions of how valuable the process is. Don't go our word for it, though. Let's also look again at the Corporate Research Board in terms of their data. And again, they're finding pretty similar data. Only about 60% of employees feel that the performance reviews are not worth their time. And then in terms of the people that feel like they're receiving feedback that will help them improve, very in line with the numbers that we've got. And of course, this is based on a group of Fortune 1000 companies. So there's a fair bit of data suggesting that, in fact, performance reviews are not achieving what they ought to be in terms of the goals that we've got for them at an organizational level and an individual level. So why is that? What does traditional performance evaluation look like? I talked about kind of what it looks like at its best, but let's think about it from almost a personal standpoint. I mean, what happens when you do a performance review is you sit down with your manager, and your manager, you've documented what you think you've done for the year, and your manager gives you feedback about where they think you're at, and you kind of have some sorting of those two perspectives, and you come up with an agreed upon kind of outcome as to how you're doing. At the end of the day, though, the manager is really driving this. It's the manager's judgment about your performance. So if you think about that, what that looks like really is something like you're going to have, and of course there's more than 4 different types of managers, but the basic gist is that, depending on who your manager is, you get to choose one. So one of these is going to give you feedback. And so in some ways, the luck of the draw of which one of these you get is going to dictate a lot about what your review looks like. So are you, is your manager the super skeptic here on the lower right that's going to really scrutinize every detail and and question every aspect of what you're doing? Is your manager the one on the lower left that's maybe looking just out for themselves, and what have you done to make me look good? The one on the upper left I like, because she's probably the one that's just not going to give you the news. She's not going to give you the bad news. She's not going to give you the hard messages that you need to hear to move up or grow or whatever. The real crux of the problem here, though, is not just that they have their own point of view, and it may not be a very useful point of view from the perspective of providing feedback. The real crux of the problem is that they're not giving you multiple perspectives, and it's just one person. You just get to choose one. So there's some real challenges embedded just in the process itself. And so what we find is that fundamentally, one of the reasons we're getting that 6% that have just basically given up is that that this methodology isn't achieving one of those core 3 goals. So it may indeed be providing decent document for legal defense. It may indeed allow them to allocate rewards appropriately or allocate them appropriately, perhaps different question, but it's really not allowing them to provide appropriate improvement feedback. So what we want to consider then is, well, what about, and we get this question probably once a week, we get asked, well, gee, from companies that have these problems in terms of their performance management, they say, well, gee, there's this other tool. What if we were to just use 360 feedback as our performance review instead? Because then it wouldn't be just choose one, right? And so we end up in lots of conversations, and that's the gist of what I'd like to cover today, is that kind of question of how do we use 360s for performance management, and if so, how? Well, let's look at 360s and kind of a quick review of what really 360 feedback is. So 360 feedback is the notion that you can, the feedback recipient, the person getting their review, can get feedback from more than just one person. So instead of just the one supervisor, let's look at their peers. Let's talk to their direct reports. Maybe they had a project this week. Or this year that revolved around people across the organization. Let's talk to them, and then let's take all of those data together. Now you can see in this graphic, that other group, it's not like all those people are going to, love or hate this person. They're going to have their own point of views. There's a variety of perspectives. The direct reports, same thing. There's a variety. But the idea is that when you put all these points of views together and you understand the different perspectives, then you get a much more balanced view of how it's doing, and then you can give them feedback on how to improve on the basis of those different perspectives, because of course working with multiple people is how we get our work done. So there's some real promise here in terms of addressing the concern that many are facing with performance management in terms of what 360s can do to address it. Let's look a little further. My colleagues and I, when we define 360 feedback, we think about it in these kind of 3 core terms. The first being that it's a survey-based tool. So there's all kinds of ways, and people have labeled 360 in many different ways. It can be interviews. It can be individual conversations. It can be a lot of different ways. What we're saying is survey-based feedback. So you've got a methodology for collecting data from a broad number of people using surveys that are quantified. The focus is on workplace behavior, so it's not personality. It's not, this person's really nice. It's not a popularity contest. It's much more specific. It's, does this person follow through on commitments? Do they listen to others? Do they delegate effectively? Very specific workplace behaviors. It's a critical component. And then, of course, the notion of multiple sources of feedback. And you're looking at them not as an overall average, but as different groups. So it may be that your peers see that you follow through on commitments horribly, but your boss sees that you follow through on commitments extremely well, and understanding the difference between those is one of the core benefits of a 360 process, because it may indeed be that you don't overall follow through commitments or not, but with one group you do and with one group you don't. All right, so people often ask, well, then what does it actually look like? And so we've got this slide that kind of gives a pretty good perspective, I think, on the whole thing in one spot. So as I mentioned, there's going to be a survey. It's going to be rated quantitatively, and you can use different scales here. This is what we use in our Leadership Navigator, but there are other 5-point scales, and I could go into scales for days, but the short version is 5 points is perfect, and you can relabel as you want. But you've got behaviors like this, follows through on commitments, right? So what you're being asked to do is to rate this individual on how well does he follow through on commitments when given the opportunity, and 1 through 5. And what we do is we add those data into results that look like this. So they rate themselves. So he, in this case, feels that he almost always follows through on commitments when given the opportunity. His boss feels like he always does. His peers, a little more than almost always. Direct reports, though, a slightly different story. So you can see here again the nuances where the different groups have different points of view. And then we do give one overall score, in this case 4.0. So in this way, he can look at his data and really try to understand, well, how am I doing and what can I do better? Obviously, I don't need to improve much with my boss in terms of follow-through, but I really should have a good conversation with my direct reports about what kind of follow-through I need to be doing. So much more useful from that third component in terms of offering up development. I'll just point out one other small thing on this particular graph, which is that the down arrow is a reference to our normative data. So in this case, a score of 4.0 would be in the bottom 20th percentile based on a national database. So that gives a sense of, okay, it's almost always, but actually almost everyone does that. So maybe there is more room to grow here than you might think. It can be a useful way to get people moving forward. Not always essential, but it can be valuable. So anyway, that's pretty much what 360s look like. The question then becomes, okay, so if this is the data, if these are the data we're collecting and the data that we're reporting and giving to the individual, it's multifaceted. How do we get that to then help people learn, grow, and develop? Well, the fundamental component within 360s that help people grow and change and understand their strengths and weaknesses is self-awareness. So self-awareness, being aware, and again, if you think back to his results, he may not have been aware that his direct reports felt that he had room to grow there. And so it's an opportunity to provide insight that he wasn't originally aware of about how he's doing on the basis. And the truth here is that those direct reports are not going to walk up to their boss and say, you know, you don't really follow through on commitments very well. Could you improve that? So there's another component here of giving them a mechanism to anonymously provide that feedback, allows them to open up in ways that they might not do face-to-face. So awareness is critical. First step is you got to get people to be aware of their opportunities for growth and, frankly, also their strengths. A lot of people aren't aware of how effective they are in the areas that they really are quite strong. So giving somebody awareness is a good first step. It turns out, though, that awareness isn't really quite enough. You need also to get to some other things. So, for example, this leader is probably aware that she's holding on to a few things that she might be able to delegate out. She's probably aware that she's got more to do than she herself can accomplish. But has she accepted that she needs to change that? And so, getting people to this point of acceptance, and Dave Bracken and I have written an article about this where this is kind of a key element of you've got to get people to the acceptance of the need to change. They've got to be able to see that. And so how do you get them to that point? If you get them aware, that's one thing, but how do you get them to the point where they actually see the need to change? So there are some key factors in getting to that point. You can't just throw a report at them and say, there you go, there's your 360 report, I'll expect change tomorrow. Won't happen. Instead, we talk about kind of 3 core areas to think about when you think about change. So you need relevant content. The survey items themselves have to relate to what they do. So if you were to rate me, for example, on how well I cook a steak, I'm not going to necessarily think about that as relevant to my job. If you ask, how well do I follow through in commitments, now I'm paying attention. So the content needs to be relevant. The data that you collect has to be credible as well. I believe that this is an accurate representation of what people think and feel about how I'm doing on the job. And then even that then gets me to awareness, and maybe I've got acceptance that indeed I need to change that. But if you don't have some accountability, it turns out that people will sort of leave that on the side as something that's somewhat interesting, but not going to take action. So what that looks like from a design standpoint are kind of 4 different components. So I would say from a relevant content standpoint, you want clear, actionable, relevant behaviors. I gave some examples of that. Incredible data, there are a bunch of things that you do from a process standpoint to make sure you've got credible data, but one of the most important ones is anonymity. So there are a lot of different features you build into a 360 process to make sure that the people providing feedback are not, their identity is not connected to their ratings. You saw in the rating results, it's not that there were any names attached to any ratings. In fact, it was just an average score. So it's really impossible to know which direct report provided what rating, because that's not really the point. So that anonymity really improves and increases people's the accuracy of people's data. And then also you need the appropriate feedback providers, right? So again, if you were to ask my daughter about how well I cook steak, that's not going to change what I do. If you ask my daughter how well I follow through on commitments, not going to change what I do at work. Ask my direct reports about how I follow through on commitments. Now I'm paying attention. So you got to have the right raters, and that's an important component, making sure that rater selection is done properly. And then the last piece is around accountability. So you need coaching support. You need someone to meet with that individual to look at the data and help them get to acceptance, and then also provide some form of accountability for follow-up so that they know someone else is paying attention. It's not just that desk drop, here's your report, good luck. It's here's your report, you're going to meet coach to talk about it. Okay, well, and they're going to give you some set of goals or help you prioritize what are the key development areas. Now you've got some accountability for addressing that change, and then of course having that coach work with that person's manager around did they actually change is another key component. So if you're building these things in, 360s can be extremely valuable for addressing some of the challenges that performance management has and that are causing some organizations to question their utility. So this gets us to what in my field has been affectionately called sort of the great debate. So there are kind of two, if you will, two factions of perspective on the use of 360s. The Center for Creative Leadership has long been a staunch defender of the idea that 360s are owned only by the person getting the feedback, and that it's up to them about what they do with it. And they would say you should give them all the supports I just talked about, but that it's really up to them, and that the report is theirs to use as they please. There's a whole other group of researchers and practitioners that would argue, wait a minute, this is really valuable data. Maybe we should be using it for more than just development. And maybe there have been some that have even argued, well, this is actually paid for by the company, so the company ought to have a copy of the report, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a real tension in the field around these two perspectives. In general, I would say that there's been, CCL has been perhaps the most well received in this regard. There's kind of perhaps a bit more well endorsed. Although interestingly, as we'll see in a moment, the data may not support that that's a universal, and it's not necessarily as simple as the dichotomy that I've placed here. So what that really means when these two perspectives, if you think about, well, what exactly is development only and what exactly is decision making, they kind of divide in these two areas. So are you using 360s for development planning, to help teamwork, to help individuals decide, or are you using it for performance management to decide who might get a promotion or not, succession planning? And there's sort of these two different perspectives. Clearly, CCL would be on the left side, and Debacle and others would be on the right. So the question is, how do we accomplish the tool on the right? Can we just simply throw 360s in? And to what extent is that happening? So again, back to the data. 3D Group does a benchmark study every couple years of current 360 practices. So we studied over 200 companies across, 30 or so industries, asking them key questions about their design and what exactly do you do. So we're very careful not to like a pool of our clients. It's across the country, what do people do when they're implementing 360s, how long is their survey, who gets a copy of the report, just about everything you can think about from a design standpoint in terms of how 360s get implemented. So when we look into those data to address this question and ask, well, okay, so if you can use 360s for development and you can use it for performance management, how often do companies do each? And of course, it's not as simple as that. So what we see when we ask that question is we ask it in sort of 4 different buckets around, is it self-directed development only? Is it for personnel decisions and development? Is it personnel decisions only? Or development planning decisions. And you can see that it's, of course, a kind of a widely varying group. It's not as though you've got 37% in self-directed and everyone else in personnel decisions. It's a little bit more shades of gray. But you can get to the point where you combine some of these and realize, okay, so pure kind of that pure development only perspective really is a third, and the other group, HR is involved in some way in making decisions. It could be decisions around who's going to get training. It could be decisions around who's going to, develop this way or that way. It may inform succession planning, but there's some kind of, kind of core decision-making component that involves the organization, not just the individual, and it may be related to organizational needs, not just the individual's needs around development. So it seems that there is some increased usage, and this is, I think, part of the interest in this topic is, okay, so if we're going to do it, then how do we do it? I do want to point out, Dave Bracken and Alan Church have put together a pretty good answer to this question of the dichotomy, which I think is important to recognize, that it's not actually as simple as development or decision making. So they've got this great graph that describes, I think, the idea that actually it's more of a continuum. There's kind of more development only or more decision making to the right. So everything all the way to the extreme of sort of downsizing. Could you use 360 scores to decide who's downsized and who isn't, or is it just information only? Those are the two ends of the spectrum. But there's a whole lot in the middle, and I think it's useful to think about that continuum, and particularly think about that continuum in design. This is one of the reasons when we look at our benchmark data, one of the major conclusions we've come to over the last 15 years of doing these studies is that every program is different. Every program, there's no sort of, there's a handful of generalities that you can use in terms of, what rater groups typically are and what the rating scale is typically 5 point, things like that. There are a few kind of commonalities, but if you look at them, each program is so radically different. And part of it is because there's this continuum, and the uses that an organization is looking for end up driving the way they design their program. So each 360 program does vary quite a bit. So if we have this kind of continuum, we get back to, again, this notion of, could we simply use the 360 for our performance management? Can I replace my performance management with a 360 process? And again, I wonder, maybe those 6% are trying that. I would contend, and I'll get into the details about why, that's probably not a good idea. And the reason why is the Jawahar and Williams study that's almost 20 years ago now, but a very well done study. It's a meta-analysis they did where they looked at 22 different peer-reviewed studies with over 60,000 cases, just under 60,000 cases, asking the question, do ratings change when you use a 360 for development, and you compare then a 360 that you then use for personnel decision making? When people fill the surveys out, do they actually change their answers on the basis of how it's going to be used? Interesting question, and when they looked at across lots of different studies that asked that question, they came up with some pretty clear data that suggests that, in fact, when employees know that the results are going to be used for some sort of an evaluation that will drive some form of the person's salary or their career or their job status, they inflate their ratings. So the bottom line is people don't want to be the bad guy. They don't want to be the one that doesn't, that even someone that is, not performing as well as they could, they're going to inflate their ratings and give them the benefit of that. I don't want to be the one that didn't get them the raise or didn't, prevented them from getting the job. And so when you look at the data, the ratings actually go up when you just change the purpose. So their recommendation was pretty clear that you need to use extreme caution when doing this, because those ratings for administration really are artificially high, and indeed not just do they go up, but they've got range restriction, and I'm not going to get into the details of what range restriction and criterion contamination are, but the notion of range restrictions basically is that it's a lot less variability. So ratings go up, and the range of ratings is much less. People basically just give them the benefit of the doubt. We also have some of our own data that point out to this same thing. So we went into our data set and said, okay, well, let's see if we can parse out the clients that have used 360s for administrative purposes, very much similar or identical to performance reviews, and compare those ratings, same exact items, to a group of companies and employees that use it just for development, and we find a very similar thing. So you can see here that using our Leadership Navigator tool, our off-the-shelf, pre-validated instrument, if you look at all the different competencies, all 8 different competencies here, the development-only group ratings are quite a bit lower. It's about 1/3 of a standard deviation, pretty consistent with Johauer and Williams, just across the board. When you use it for performance management, those scores elevate, and again, the range gets shorter. So the concern here is that there's a real impact in just changing the purpose in terms of the accuracy of those ratings. That's something besides that. If you're doing it just for development, if I'm rating somebody and all I want to do is to help them improve, I'm going to tell them the real scoop, and my ratings are going to be a little bit more critical and more, if you will, honest. But if it's going to be around administrative decision making, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to be the bad guy. And so that's a real concern from an accuracy standpoint, because in the data you're using to make very important decisions is kind of by definition conflated with another criteria, another factor other than what's actually going on. It's ego protecting, if you will. So why are they inflated? I've hit on this, but basically it constrains employee candor. They feel, that they don't want to be that bad guy. They don't want to inflate the score. They don't want to be the one that didn't get them to advance. And then there's also this notion of maybe it's not anonymous, and so I'm not going to make the rating of what I'm actually observing. I'm going to make the rating on what I think is going to impact this person in the way I want them to be impacted. So there's some real caution, again, based on the research and the data around how to do this. Now, again, as I mentioned, we get asked this question a lot, and there's a lot of interest in but there's got to be a way to get this really, this really valuable tool for development, the 360 process, to support or augment or replace, or there's got to be a way to blend these two things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a couple of examples. I've got it's actually the same client that's done 2 different ways of getting their 360 to support the performance management process and serve some of the needs that the performance management process is targeted at. So a way that works extremely well, in effect, to address this issue. So the first thing is around getting better at providing performance feedback. So how do you use a 360 review to address this gap that we saw in the performance management process? So again, I'm going to present 2. The first one is going to really address this issue here. So the first approach of the 2 is, again, helping people prioritize their development. So we know that people feel like when they get their performance review, it's not useful for prioritizing their development, doesn't tell them how they're improving. So how can we use the 360 to help them do that better? Again, the idea of giving them actionable feedback, adding in more perspectives is more valuable than just that one manager, that one boss, luck of the draw. And then also the importance here of having an independent feedback coach that can really help them put it in context to understand, well, what is the better priority here and where should I be focused? So that's going to be the first case. And then the second case I'm going to talk about is a way to use the 360 process to fit with what people are currently doing in their performance review to make that better. So kind of 2 different approaches to how to use the 3 process to level it up. All right. So again, when we think about the prioritizing. In this particular case, what we were tasked with was to say, okay, we really want to make sure that the development goals and the improvement, the things that we identify for people that they feel really good about. So we built a process and timed it and structured it in a whole and integrated it well with the performance management in such a way that only the employee got their own coworker feedback, and that's what was used to prioritize development. So now the CCL people are very happy here because it's just only that person getting the feedback. But then what we did was we staggered the implementation. So in July, mid-year, they're getting their 360s on what do I need to do to improve. And that helps them then toward getting those goals achieved by the end of the year. Now, by staggering, it's very clear that the two processes are separate. One is really developmentally oriented, and one is really just going to be about results, if you will. But of course, the 360 and components, as we'll see here, of the 360 find their way into the performance review. And in doing this, they were very careful to communicate the differences between the two. They were very careful to say the July 360 is not your performance review. It's intended to help you prioritize your development. But then what they did was they provided a coach that worked with each individual to figure out, in the context of what's going on in their work, context of the feedback and who was providing the raters, who the raters were that were providing the feedback, what are the key takeaways here? What are your development areas? And once they agreed upon that, the coach actually summarized and pushed that out to the manager. So the manager, the person's manager, is now involved in knowing what the development areas are, even though he or she doesn't have a copy of the report. So in this way, you're able to integrate it into the performance management because the manager can then look at it and doing the performance review and say, okay, it looks like these should be your areas of focus and development, and how are you doing on them, and let's keep you going in this direction. And so by doing this, you end up getting kind of the best of both worlds, and in the feedback and the prioritization of development that shows up in the performance review is much, much more relevant, and again addresses many of those questions around multiple sources, trusting the feedback, all that sort of thing. So this process has been very, very successful. In fact, we also do the engagement survey for this organization, and their engagement scores around this particular issue about the usefulness of their performance review for identifying development priorities is quite a bit better. So we've had some great success in doing this and just basically using the 360 for what it is best used for, but timing it right and then making sure that there's a constructive way to have it be an input into the performance management process that does not break some of the critical aspects of getting accurate feedback from a development perspective using the 360. All right, so in this example, we've sort of covered the left side of this continuum, if you will, from a development planning, self-development sort of perspective, and we've supported the right side, but we haven't really hit directly on. So Dave and company are probably like, okay, that's nice, but still, there's more you can do with those data. Isn't there a way to use the 360 to really support accurate performance management? So same client asked the same question, and so what we did was we said, well, let's take a look at what you're currently doing and what's going on in your organization. So we interviewed a bunch of managers, and what we found is, not unlike many organizations, if we want to try to address this edge of the continuum, we find that many managers were sending out, as part of that process, emails. So they would send out emails to a set of colleagues around the person they're trying to evaluate, and they would basically ask the question, hey, how'd Jane do this year? And then they would get some smattering of emails back. So maybe they send out 10 emails and they get 6 back, and they think, oh, great, I got 6 emails back. Great, how's Jane doing? And they go through and they look at those answers that are written verbatim and use that then as evidence, if you will, to put into their performance management ratings and comments. This is probably not the best possible thing, and maybe there's a way that 360 can address this. So if you think about it, what's going on here? Is there anonymity? Absolutely not. So do you have accurate ratings? Well, we know, because we know that ratings get inflated even when the purpose has changed, but when anonymity is not even there, people are going to be even more congratulatory. And so more than likely the 4 that didn't respond, if you don't have anything good to say. So there's some concern there around accuracy just because the anonymity isn't there. The other thing is different questions. So all the different managers across the organization, some are just saying, hey, how'd Jane do? And others are saying, hey, was Jane nice this year? Did Jane, they may be more specific, and they might be more specific in ways that frankly are creating some unintended bias. Maybe intended bias. Maybe this is an individual the manager's really been trying to get rid of, so they're asking specific questions that might help serve the purpose that they have for their evaluation. Maybe they're really trying to move people out, trying to get that, that answer they want. And then of course some employees have their managers doing this and some don't. So there's lots of variability and a lot of challenges. And most HR managers, when they look at this list, their kind of red flags start going up. So what we said is, well, all right, let's see if we can address this concern and leverage 360 to do it. So instead of the developmental 360 that I talked about before, what we did was we did an additional 360 process wherein only the person's manager gets the report. And that was very explicitly used to inform their development, their performance review. And it was also timed just for that. It was very clear to everybody. So in this case, though, it's only 10 questions. So it's 10 very performance-specific, not behavior, not kind of, follows through on commitments, acts with a sense of urgency, admits mistakes. These are all good things from a developmental standpoint, but not necessarily from a performance review standpoint from an achievement. So there were some real specific, and I'll give some examples on my next slide. The other thing is that we made a very transparent link. So it's very clear to all employees the answers you're using here are going to the manager, so the manager can improve their ratings of the person. It's going to be incorporated into their performance review. And so, whereas this 360 is being done in November, immediately preceding the performance management tool, so it's very clear to everyone what the purpose is, and then lots of effort at differentiating it from the development-oriented 360. And then we spent a lot of time training the managers on how to use this and how not to use this, and really making sure that their input, it was an input and it was done properly. And again, looking at things like response rates and that sort of thing to make sure that they're really using the data well. If they get odd comments, they're being careful about how they use those or don't use those, that sort of thing. So, our sense here, and then, also the other key element is this: you're able to standardize the list of raters. You're able to say all of your direct reports are going to feed this, all of these peers, and it's easily auditable in terms of how many people have responded and who was invited. So it can be standardized across the organization who it is that's being invited. So what did it look like? I wanted to just kind of throw in a couple of key elements to give you an idea of what we really meant and how it kind of differentiated. So, for example, still a 5-point scale, and you can use this. In this case, they did, in fact, have the scale map on. So the 5-point scale was also different from the developmental 360. It was more performance management. But it was questions like, did the person, did they met deadlines or they didn't this year? Did they deliver high quality work? Did they collaborate well with you? Just a couple of key things that are going to drive directly to their results, if you will, more so than just the behavior that get their results, which was the July implementation. And then the open-ended questions were, what specific achievements did you observe? So what did they accomplish? And then where did the person fall short of expectations? So again, the tenor of it is very clearly around trying to support and improve the performance management aspect of the development aspect of performance management, but also the documentation aspect of it. So in doing this, we were able to provide 2 different ways of leveraging the 360 process, very different processes in terms of timing and positioning and communicating, but both very much using the methodology of 360 feedback to support some of the key gaps in performance management. So, a couple of examples here, and I wanted to leave a little time because I know we've got some questions, but also I like to leave people with kind of one thing. I've gone through a few dozen slides here, and there's a lot of information. So I like to think if you're going to take away one thing, what ought that takeaway be? And so let me help you with that. the basic premise here is that 360 feedback, it can't replace performance management. It's not going to achieve all of those 3 goals. It's simply not going to do that if you take it verbatim. But it can improve its performance depending on how you do it. So I hope that was useful. I do want to give some time for questions here. Let's see what questions have come up either before or during my presentation, and maybe you can help me, Jesse, with what we've got.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start out with some sort of general 360 questions. So someone asked, what's the best way to present feedback to people getting reviews so that it has context and perspective and doesn't end up cratering someone's self-confidence?
Yes. When I run into people, and I mentioned that I do 360 feedback, they either sort of love it or hate it. It sounds like this person has run into some challenges in terms of the cratering their confidence. I would say that when 360s are done poorly and implemented poorly and not supported well enough, that's when people tend to really get lots of negative reactions because they don't have the support, as the questioner pointed out, to kind of put it in context and decide, well, what do I do with this and how do I move it forward? So number one, absolutely get a coach, an independent coach to work. It's not a 6-month engagement of dialogue. It could be just an hour and a half to kind of work through that feedback and say, all right, what do I take away? How do I boil it down to a couple, 3 areas to focus on? And how do I let go and get past some of these things that are concerning to me? So the number one thing there is just to get someone, people that are getting the report, have some follow-up support from a professional that can help them make sense of it and make it actionable rather than feeling like it's just a judgment.
Okay, great. Before we do the next one, if anyone has more questions, there's still time to enter them in. So someone asked, how do you effectively implement a 360-degree review process with a large number of hourly staff without monopolizing all of your time?
Yes, we run into this particularly with HR folks all the time where they're very oversubscribed. It's one of the reasons why I think organizations like ours do, basically I'd recommend a full service implementation. So, you can go out and kind of get software and try to run it all yourself. I actually was talking to somebody yesterday who was doing this all manually through emails sent to a HR person that was trying to compile them all, and I'm thinking, wow, you're spending a whole lot of time, doing what we do instead of what you do, which is to work with your employees and your population. So, work with a group that's going to really help, a 360 provider that's really helping the HR person make it easy for them and minimizing impact on them is absolutely critical because it can be very complex. So I guess the basic answer is do it yourself is going to be not as good as bringing in a professional. I've found that out in trying to do some home improvements myself, and I now hire contractors.
So when implementing a new process, Dale, is it best to start with the management group before rolling it out to the general population of employees?
Yeah, particularly if it's new, I think that's important. If the process is new to an organization, they haven't done 360s, it's always good. There's a lot of concern here often when it is rolled out. It helps to have kind of an introduction, but I think then that concern is around, whoa, we're going to be talking about how we're all doing? How's that going to work? Because we've never done it before, and that feels awkward. And when people learn the process, they realize, oh, okay, they've thought it through, and they're being careful around our identity and confidentiality and those kinds of things. But there's nothing quite like having the person at the top do it first to make people realize, okay, this isn't being done to me, this is being done for me. So yeah, we typically recommend early on in doing a process that it be top down, that you really start at the very top and that there's an initial, that person at the top is really coming out saying to the organization, hey, I did this, it was really valuable, it helped me find the things I need to do better, appreciate the feedback, and then people realize the orientation, they kind of see it rather than just being told, oh no, really, this is for your development. There can be some skepticism. So I definitely agree, starting at the top and rolling it down is best.
So almost related to that, what has been the reception of management to 360s, and then sort of a second part, how do companies weigh the results from different groups of raters?
Yeah, so generally our experience is that management really appreciates 360s, again, when they're done well. I mean, I think what we run into is sometimes management that has had a really bad experience because it's been implemented poorly and not enough support, or with really bad items and difficult reporting and that kind of thing. So when people run into that, they get kind of a negative experience, but when they've had a positive experience, they realize, wow, this can really unlock a lot of issues within our organization, and particularly with senior management teams. We do a lot of work with executive teams where it'll be the whole executive team getting feedback and giving feedback to each other, and then you can kind of combine that. So I think senior management tends to value it when it's done well, and they recognize that. But you can run into challenges when someone's had a negative experience, and that's where, kind of giving some ideas of what best practices are. That's where our benchmarking study is very helpful to help people sort of see how, I think it's like 2/3 of companies include some sort of follow-up support from coaching, things like that, can help senior management get that, okay, maybe my bad experience before wasn't a good one, and maybe I should relook at this. But usually the ones that have had the experience, it's funny, I can think of one client that I followed up after the second year. I think we'd worked with them, and I said, hey, maybe we should do a little evaluation study and see what managers think of the feedback process. And he just very quickly said, no, I know what we're doing here. I've been coached. I get the feedback. I know. This is great. So I think when they get the positive experience, they realize the value of it. When they don't, that it can be kind of difficult.
Okay. What we had during your presentation was what kind of preparation and support can you recommend for managers to get them ready to present results to and coach employees, if that's the way they're doing it?
Yeah, so I would be a little cautious in that process. We worked with clients that are pretty sophisticated, where their management is very strong and they're really capable of that. But there's often a lot of variability, particularly in a large organization. There's a lot of variability in manager skills, and so it's very cost effective, and it can work with a small subset of managers. But the managers who are already having a hard time developing their employees will often fumble this process in terms of delivering the feedback. They'll have a hard time putting it in context. They'll dwell on one comment, that kind of thing. So the one thing is training. Make sure you train managers. If they're going to be delivering the feedback, make sure you train them a whole ton. Make sure the HR managers are aware, because they usually know kind of who the people are that are going to need support, and make sure they're kind of close to it and able to step in as needed. And then the other thing is, and this is probably the biggest, is to start at the top and roll down so that a manager themselves, before they're giving feedback to their direct report, they've had it from their manager, so they get a chance to experience how nervous am I, and all that kind of thing. And so you can kind of make best practices trickle down that way, and that gives you the best chance for success.
Okay. We had several people ask about how long does a 360 feedback process typically take?
Well, the typically is the key there. We've done the fastest we've ever done. We've done a 360 from launch of survey to coaching conversation in 24 hours. It's pretty exceptional. It was a case where the CEO's assistant literally got a phone and called every rater and said, I'm not getting off the phone until you get on the internet and fill out the survey. So that's pretty exceptional. But typically it's probably in the order of 4 weeks, something like that. Depends a little bit on how big of a project and what you're doing for rater selection. Identifying raters can take its own time. That can take a week or sometimes even 2 in different organizations. But I think 4 weeks is a typical process to think about.
Okay, so I have one more before we're running out of time here today. We know you all have other things to move on to. So what are the most effective ways to conduct a 360 review with a small firm, and how can we ensure our employees feel comfortable and protected?
Yeah, so we do 360s with huge $100 billion companies, and then all the way down to even smaller, really small, even 40, 50 people. And so when you've got a small group like that, the main thing is it's in some ways the same, but you've got to make sure you have at least 3 respondents for each category before you present results. I highly recommend that you have an orientation meeting, so you really ideally bring out the person that's going to be doing the coaching to all the participants and to all the raters. Again, the nice thing about a small company is you can often get everyone in the same room, and even if it's just 30 minutes to kind of answer questions and let them bring up their concerns, so that external party can kind of bring the answers and say, oh yeah, no, we aren't going to be sharing your responses with anybody. We're the only ones that will have that. Here's how we protect your so really being able to answer those questions head on up front before the process starts, I think, is really critical. But a lot of the mechanisms that we put in place for huge companies work really well for small companies too, protecting people's identity and assuring anonymity, making sure that the coach is there to support and provide context. Yeah, so there are ways to do it, but again, the biggest thing, take advantage of your size, get everyone in the room, address it face on, and also lead from the top. Make sure that the top leader in the organization is saying, I'm doing this because I want us to get better, and this is a great way to do it. When they hear that authentically from the CEO or president, it means a lot more in a small company even than in a large one.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending and for all your thoughtful questions. If you have questions that we didn't address here today, feel free to reach out to us directly. You can give us a call, visit our website. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.